Mossel Bay, a town of crashing waves, manicured estates, and houses pressed so close together that you can hear your neighbor breathe. It was a man who was supposed to love her, and a guest who was never supposed to kill. From the luxury of Pinnacle Point to the narrow lanes of Asla Park, the architecture here promises safety, either behind gates, behind doors, or behind silence. But walls can't hold back violence, and sometimes the floor plan leaves you with nowhere to run. Today, we step inside two homes, one shattered by betrayal, one soaked in survival, two murders, one town, and the spaces that couldn't save them. This is Brick and Blood, South African Town Tales. The bodies told the story first. Inside the villa on the quiet ridge of Pinnacle Point, nothing looked broken from the outside. The lawn was still trimmed, the flower pots undisturbed, but past the foyer, in the back bedroom, bathed in pale winter light, something unspeakable had happened. Marietha Willemse, 79, sat slumped in her upholstered armchair, the same chair she used every morning to sip rooibos while watching the sea mist roll in. Her hands hung limp at her sides. A deep wound marked the left side of her neck. Clean, decisive, fatal. Blood had soaked through her cream cardigan, staining it a cruel, rusted red. It had pooled beneath the chair legs and splattered up the walls. In the hallway, small, bloody footprints smeared in both directions. Moments earlier, her husband, Johannes Willemse, 85, had stood in that very doorway. He hadn't immediately understood what he was seeing. His dementia already stealing his ability to place events in sequence made time tilt sideways. His wife was motionless, her eyes wide but unfocused. He reached towards her, calling her name once, then again, but the silence in the room was too heavy. It pressed on his chest like grief made physical. Then he looked down, blood on the floor, on his hands, and pain, a sharp, delayed, like his body was waited for his mind to catch up. He'd been stabbed too, twice in the shoulder and once in the chest. Confused and bleeding, Johannes turned from the room. He didn't phone anyone. He didn't scream. He did what instinct or perhaps love told him to do. He walked next door. Their daughter, Mia Heur, lived in the adjacent villa, just across the short stretch of hedged lawn. He knocked, then banged, then collapsed into her arms. When emergency services arrived, they followed a trail of blood from Mia's front patio back into the Willemse home. The front door was unlocked. The security gate stood open, unbothered, as if no one had ever come or gone with ill intent. Inside, the paramedics paused, not out of shock, but in the heavy stillness of confirmed violence. The room where Marietha died had the unmistakable smell of death, blood thickening in the air, copper and salt. Windows were open, and from the cliffs below, the scent of kelp and cold sea brine drifted in. It mixed with the blood, nature intruding upon the unnatural. The curtains fluttered gently, as if the room itself were exhaling one long final breath. One officer bent to inspect the doorframe. There was no forced entry. Another lifted a fingerprint from the inner handle. A third followed the bloody prints towards the rear patio, noting where a set of gardening shoes had been disturbed, but not taken. On the bedside table, a mug of cold tea sat untouched. What Marietha had seen before the knife came down, no one can say. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chair, no defensive wounds, just that final wound, the most intimate kind of violence. As investigators moved through the home, they found more signs of intrusion. A drawer of valuables left gaping, a jewelry box emptied, and yet no alarm triggered. No neighbors heard a sound. It was mid-morning, broad daylight, and somehow no one saw who came or went. It would take months to learn the intruder had once worked here, on these very grounds. He had trimmed hedges, painted walls, swept patios. He knew who lived where, and more importantly, who was vulnerable. But for now, all the first responders had was blood, silence, and the terrible stillness of a room where safety was supposed to be absolute. Pinnacle Point Estate brands itself on top-tier security, boom gates, biometric checkpoints, thermal cameras, and monitored access 24/7. Still, the estate borders a public St. Blaise hiking trail, a servitude that presented one of its few vulnerabilities. Permitted access not fully contained within the estate's perimeter. Neighbors recalled seeing a stranger approach Marietha as she was washing her car, unnoticed behind an open gate. Security, they said, seemed weak despite the cameras. Residents say the estate had ignored warning signs even after 2 burglaries earlier that week. As the investigation unfolded, Clement Siabata Kolowane, 40, a Lesotho national, was identified. His fingerprints matched those found at the crime scene. Months later, police apprehended him in the Free State after an extensive manhunt and a reward of 50,000 rand. Kolowane entered a plea agreement in November of 2023. In December, the George Regional Court sentenced him to 37 years in prison for charges including murder, attempted murder, burglary, and breach of the Immigration Act. In the aftermath, emotions among residents ran raw. Their daughter, Mia Hur, shared the family's anguish. Her mother had paid the price for lax security. Nothing valuable was stolen, suggesting the attack was personal, intentional, or even psychologically motivated. Security cameras hadn't intervened. Many residents say they began installing private alarms and fences because they did not trust the estate's common systems anymore. Some even moved away, citing a broken sense of safety at what was supposed to be a sanctuary. At its heart, this crime unfolded where walls were meant to protect, not exclude danger. The design of the estate with its seamless gates and seductive openness created a false sense of security because crime wasn't in the bushes or from a break-in. It came in through a gate that the killer walked through. That breach shattered more than one life. Ghost echoes linger in the quiet corners of Pinnacle Point. The estate still markets itself with empty green fairways and ocean panoramas. But those views now feel tainted, untrusting. For residents, the memory of Marietha sitting in her chair moments after the assault is inescapable. She was 79, fragile only to time, not to violence. Johannes' survival story includes pain, memory loss, post-traumatic fear, far greater threats than any passing breeze off the cliffs. Justice may have been delivered. 37 years is lengthy. But for those who fled Pinnacle Point or now walk its paths in uneasy silence, the illusion of safety died with Marietha. This wasn't just murder, it was a rupture in faith. Faith in security, in retirement sanctuaries, in architectural promise, because a home can be both fortress and trap. And when the walls don't hold, what's left? Only the questions. It was a cold, brittle Sunday afternoon in Asla Park, Mossel Bay, the kind of winter day where wind creeps through unsealed window panes and zinc rooftops echo every gust like a warning. In this dense housing development, homes are pressed shoulder to shoulder, their walls so thin you can hear your neighbors cough through the plasterboard. This is where Lily Joubert had lived for nearly 30 years, and on June 8, 2025, it became the site of something she never wanted, but perhaps, in her words, had long been coming. Inside the modest home on Mabolo Street, a 65-year-old husband, Henry Peter Joubert, was dying on the living room floor. 2 stab wounds, one to the chest, one to the back. He wasn't a stranger to her. He was her husband, the father of her children. But on that day, in that moment, he had become something else, a threat. Emergency responders arrived just after 3 p.m. The TV was still on, a cooking show flickering across a dusty screen. Lunch sat half-eaten on the counter. But the air inside was heavy with something far more immediate. The living room was still, except for the trembling figure of Lily, standing next to Henry's body, blood staining her house dress and slippers. She didn't run. She didn't try to hide. She simply looked at the officer and said, "Ek het gewaarsku. Ek was bang. I warned him. I was scared." They had lived together in that 2-room RDP house since the late 1990s. Like many houses in Asla Park, it was small, just a kitchen living space and a bathroom and 1 bedroom. Walls thin as paper, doors warped from years of damp coastal air. But inside that confined space, a longer story had been unfolding. Lily told investigators that Henry had been abusive for decades, emotionally, physically, and verbally. But there were no police records and no court orders, just memories and bruises, and walls too thin to keep it all private, and yet too strong, it seemed, to let help in. She said, "I never called because I didn't want to shame him. I thought he'd stop or I'd get used to it." On that winter Sunday, the pattern repeated itself. According to Lily, Henry had been drinking since the morning. Brandy, beer, more brandy. By 2 p.m. he was shouting. By 2:30, he'd grabbed her by the shoulder, accusing her of disrespect, of defiance. And then he lunged. In a panic, Lily said she reached for the knife, the same one she'd used to slice onions that morning, and struck out. 1 stab to the chest, another to the back as he turned. He collapsed on the frayed carpet while the smell of boiled rice hung in the air. But the architecture had always been part of the problem. There is no retreat in an RDP house. There's no second room to escape to. No back door for a safe exit. Just a single front entrance and an open plan layout that forces confrontation instead of avoiding it. The design traps people inside, both literally and emotionally. It's not just about poverty, it's about proximity. There is no space to calm down, no place to breathe, and no privacy to cry without someone hearing. In court, her lawyer said she had nowhere to run. She had been cornered in body and spirit. On 10 June, Lily stood before the Mossel Bay Magistrates Court. She looked worn, her feet swollen in plastic sandals, her hands folded in front of her. The prosecutor did not oppose bail. Neither did her children. Henry's own relatives said they'd known about his drinking, his volatility. They never expected this ending, but they weren't entirely surprised. Lily's bail was set at 1,000 rand. She was released to stay with her daughter while the investigation continued. Outside, neighbors had mixed feelings. Some said it was inevitable. Others whispered that Lily should have left years ago. One woman, a close friend, shook her head and said, "You don't understand. That house was like a cage. She was never going to get out unless something like this happened." And that is the heartbreaking truth. The house, designed for shelter, became a pressure cooker of trauma. No therapy, no escape routes, no buffer zone. Just two people locked in history, habit, and a floor plan that kept them face to face. The home is quiet now. Curtains are drawn. The garden is wild. Someone taped a note to the door for the housing committee. "Please collect keys. No one's staying here now." But the house remains, not because it holds life, but because it remembers it. You can still see the faded stain on the stoop, the cracked plant pot she tried to fill each spring. And if you listen long enough, maybe you'll hear what so many missed for so long. The silence after the shouting, the stillness that follows survival. Lily Joubert wasn't just a wife. She was a woman whose life shrank inside four walls that never gave her space to breathe. And when the violence came again, as it had before, she didn't run because there was nowhere left to go. And so she did the only thing she could. She survived. 2 homes, 2 crimes, both in Mossel Bay, yet light years apart. On a map, Pinnacle Point and Asla Park are only 15 minutes from one another. But socially, economically, and architecturally, they are separated by everything South Africa is still reckoning with. In Pinnacle Point, an exclusive estate built on status and promise, security was outsourced to high-tech solutions, perimeter walls, cameras, and controlled entrances. A place where violence was meant to be unthinkable, but it wasn't. In Asla Park, a modest residential area shaped by the struggle-era housing backlog, walls were thinner, homes closer, and arguments louder. Security wasn't imported, it was improvised, with padlocks, rusted burglar bars, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors. Yet even there, no one saw it coming. In both homes, architecture didn't protect anyone. And that's why these stories matter. In June 2025, Lily Joubert stabbed her husband Henry during an argument in the Asla Park home. She was 60, he was 65. Their fight, by her own admission, spiraled until rage gave way to bloodshed. But this wasn't just a domestic dispute. It was a failure of many systems: mental health, gender dynamics, and conflict resolution. The home was like many in Asla Park, small, tense, hot in summer. Tensions fester in places like that, especially when there's nowhere else to go, physically or emotionally. And when the architecture offers no space for de-escalation, walls begin to amplify conflict instead of muffling it. Compare that to Pinnacle Point, where architecture tried to do the exact opposite. There, crime was supposed to be locked out. In reality, it was invited in, not by the victims, but by overconfidence in a system designed for illusion, not intrusion. Clement Koloane didn't scale a fortress. He walked through an opening in the boundary. The estate's perimeter was physical, but the real vulnerability was psychological. Residents believed their lifestyle made them immune. Architect and urban sociologist Dr. Versage explains, quote, luxury estates create a myth of separation, that you can wall off violence by design, but architecture cannot erase the social dynamics of the country around it. It only delays their arrival, end quote. The Willemse home, like others in Pinnacle Point, was designed for privacy, not community. So when Marietha was attacked, no one heard, no one saw, and no one could help. These crimes force us to ask harder questions, not just how could this happen, but what did we believe would protect us and why? In Asla Park, the belief was that violence is normal, cyclical, and part of the everyday life. In Pinnacle Point, the belief was that wealth, planning, and balls make you safe. Both were wrong. The common thread? Isolation. One was isolated by geography and poverty, the other by luxury and false security. But in both, no one saw the storm coming. In South Africa, the architecture of violence is not always in the design of the buildings, but in what those buildings represent. Power, gender, race, economic inequality. In homes where trauma simmers, walls hold history. In estates built on privilege, silence becomes policy. As Dr. Hendricks puts it, we don't just live in our houses, we're shaped by them. A cramped kitchen can escalate tension. A long hallway can create emotional distance. A lack of communal space can isolate victims. Architecture isn't neutral. It either heals or harms. These stories matter because they shatter stereotypes, because not all victims are poor. Not all perpetrators are men. And not all safe spaces are truly safe. They matter because they show us what happens when we mistake containment for care and silence for peace. Mossel Bay is a town of contrasts, boardwalks and bungalows, refineries and rocky shores, privilege and precarity. In homes built for protection and in those built simply to survive, violence found its way in. The stories of Henry and Lily Joubert, of Marietha and Johannes Willemse, are not just moments of tragedy. They are stories about how space shapes our safety, how the walls we live within can hold us or fail us, and how silence doesn't always mean peace. Who gets to feel secure? Whose pain makes the headlines? And whose slips between the cracks? Architecture may be mute, but it holds memory. And if we listen closely, every brick speaks. If these stories moved you, if they made you think, then please walk further with me. Subscribe to Brick and Blood wherever you get your podcasts, or like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I release new episodes every week, each one unpacking the uneasy intersection of place, memory, and crime in South Africa's Downs. Until next time, walk softly, listen deeply, and remember, every wall has a story.